The wind howled through Pine Ridge Mountains as Margaret Chen pulled her coat tighter, spotting the beat-up Honda Civic parked behind the old gas station. Through the frosted windows, she could make out a young woman's silhouette, clearly pregnant and shivering in the sub-zero night. Most people would have driven past, but Margaret wasn't most people. At 82, she'd spent 40 years hiding from a past that haunted her dreams. The remote cabin she'd built with her late husband was her sanctuary, her secret refuge from the world that had once betrayed her. She'd sworn never to let another soul inside those walls. But something about this girl's desperate situation pierced through decades of carefully constructed isolation. Maybe it was the way she protected her unborn child even while sleeping in a freezing car. Maybe it was the familiar look of abandonment Margaret recognized from her own mirror. As Margaret approached the car, her decision would set in motion events that neither woman could imagine. What she didn't know was that this pregnant stranger held the key to a mystery that had destroyed Margaret's family 60 years ago. But could two broken souls really heal each other's deepest wounds? Margaret's weathered hand trembled as she tapped gently on the driver's side window. Inside, the young woman startled awake, her eyes wide with fear. She couldn't have been more than 19, with long auburn hair and freckles scattered across pale cheeks. Her hands instinctively moved to protect her rounded belly. "Please," Margaret called softly through the glass, her breath forming clouds in the frigid air. "I'm not going to hurt you. Are you all right?" The girl hesitated, studying Margaret's face in the dim light from the gas station's flickering neon sign. After a moment, she cracked the window barely an inch. "I'm fine," she whispered, though her chattering teeth betrayed the lie. "Just resting." "In this weather? Honey, it's going to drop to 20 below tonight." Margaret glanced at the girl's thin jacket and the empty passenger seat. "Where's your family?" Something flickered across the girl's face. Pain, shame, or maybe both. "Don't have any. Not anymore." The words hit Margaret like a physical blow. Memories she'd buried deep threatened to surface. A young woman, not much older than this girl, standing in the snow with nowhere to go. Herself, 60 years ago, before she'd learned to build walls around her heart. "What's your name?" Margaret asked. "Sophie." The girl's voice was barely audible. "Sophie Williams." "Well, Sophie Williams, I'm Margaret Chen, and you're going to freeze to death out here." Margaret straightened her shoulders, fighting against every instinct that screamed at her to walk away. "I have a cabin about 10 minutes up the mountain. It's warm, and there's plenty of food." Sophie's eyes narrowed with suspicion. "Why would you help me? You don't even know me." For a long moment, Sophie said nothing. The wind picked up, rocking the small car and sending fresh snow swirling around them. Finally, she nodded. "Just for tonight," Sophie said, rolling down the window fully. "I don't want to be any trouble." "One night at a time," Margaret agreed, though something told her this arrangement might last longer than either of them expected. As Sophie gathered her few belongings from the back seat, a worn duffel bag and a manila envelope that she clutched protectively, Margaret noticed the girl's wedding ring was missing, but the pale band of skin suggested it had been there recently. They walked to Margaret's old pickup truck in silence, their footsteps crunching in the fresh snow. As Margaret started the engine and pulled onto the winding mountain road, she stole glances at her unexpected passenger. "When are you due?" Margaret asked, focusing on the treacherous curves ahead. 6 weeks, Sophie replied, one hand resting on her belly. "Maybe less." Margaret's knuckles whitened on the steering wheel. The nearest hospital was 40 minutes away on a good day. In weather like this, it could take twice as long. "Have you been seeing a doctor?" Sophie's silence was answer enough. Now she was bringing home a pregnant stranger who looked like she hadn't had a proper meal in weeks. The cabin appeared through the trees, its windows glowing warm yellow against the white landscape. Margaret had always thought of it as her fortress, protecting her from a world that had taken everything she'd ever loved. Tonight, for the first time in 40 years, it would shelter someone else. The guest bedroom hadn't been used in 3 years. not since Margaret's nephew had visited for what turned out to be their final Christmas together. Dust motes danced in the lamplight as she pulled fresh sheets from the linen closet, her arthritic fingers working slowly but deliberately. The familiar domestic ritual calmed her racing thoughts, though she couldn't shake the image of the girl's pale face against the car window. Downstairs, she could hear movement in the kitchen, the soft shuffle of bare feet, the careful opening and closing of cabinet doors. The girl was awake, probably exploring, trying to get her bearings. Margaret didn't blame her for being cautious. Trust didn't come easily when you'd been sleeping in a car during a blizzard. Margaret smoothed the quilt across the bed, the same wedding ring pattern her mother had taught her to make 60 years ago. Every stitch held a memory, every ring a story of love and loss. She wondered what stories this unexpected guest carried, what circumstances had led a pregnant teenager to seek shelter in an old Honda Civic rather than a warm home. The floorboards creaked as she made her way downstairs, her hand trailing along the banister worn smooth by decades of use. In the kitchen doorway, she paused. The girl stood at the sink, drinking water from a mason jar with the desperation of someone who'd been rationing liquids. Her dark hair fell in tangled waves past her shoulders, and even in profile, Margaret could see the exhaustion etched in every line of her young face. "Feeling better?" Margaret asked softly, not wanting to startle her. The girl turned, and Margaret caught her first clear look at those eyes. Deep brown, ancient in a face that couldn't be more than 17. There was intelligence there, and wariness, and something that looked like carefully controlled desperation. "Yes, ma'am. Thank you." The girl's voice was stronger now, though she held herself with the defensive posture of someone ready to flee at the first sign of trouble. "I should probably go soon. The snow's letting up." Margaret glanced toward the window where snow continued to fall in thick, lazy flakes. "I don't think it is, dear, and even if it were, you're in no condition to be driving. When's the last time you had a proper meal?" The girl's hand moved instinctively to her rounded belly, a protective gesture that spoke volumes. "I had some crackers yesterday, and a banana." "Yesterday." Margaret shook her head, moving to the refrigerator with renewed purpose. "Well, that simply won't do. Sit down, please. I'm making you something substantial. I don't have any money to pay you." "Did I ask for money?" Margaret pulled eggs and cheese from the refrigerator, then paused, studying the girl's face. Something nagged at her, a sense of familiarity she couldn't quite place. "What's your name, sweetheart?" The girl hesitated, clearly debating how much truth to share. "Emma. Emma Clark." The slight pause before the surname told Margaret it was likely invented, but she didn't press. Everyone deserved their secrets, especially when they were young and scared and far from home. "Well, Emma Clark, I'm Margaret Hartwell. This is my house, my kitchen, and my decision to feed you properly. The only payment I require is that you sit down before you fall down." Emma's mouth quirked in what might have been the ghost of a smile. She eased herself into one of the kitchen chairs, her movements careful and measured. Margaret noticed how she positioned herself with a clear view of both the back door and the hallway, someone who'd learned to always know where the exits were. As Margaret whisked eggs in a bowl, she found herself studying Emma's reflection in the kitchen window. There was something about the shape of her face, the set of her shoulders, that triggered a persistent sense of déjà vu. She'd lived in this small town for 8 decades, had taught 3 generations of children in the local elementary school before retiring. Perhaps Emma reminded her of a former student, or the child of a former student. "How far along are you?" Margaret asked, pouring the eggs into the heated pan. "About 6 months." Emma's hand curved protectively over her belly again. "Maybe a little more." "And the father?" Emma's expression shuttered completely. "Not in the picture." The finality in her tone warned against further questions on that subject. Margaret focused on the eggs instead, adding cheese and herbs from her windowsill garden. The silence stretched between them, not uncomfortable exactly, but weighted with unspoken stories. Outside, the wind howled around the eaves of the old house. rattling windows and sending snow skittering across the porch. Margaret had weathered countless storms in this house, blizzards and thunderstorms, and the quieter tempests of a long life lived through joy and sorrow. But something about tonight felt different, significant in a way she couldn't yet understand. She slid the omelette onto a plate and set it before Emma, who stared at the food as if it were a mirage that might disappear. "Eat," Margaret said gently. "We'll figure out the rest tomorrow." The warmth of the house enveloped them like a gentle embrace as Margaret guided the girl through the front door. Snow melted from their coats onto the hardwood floor, creating small puddles that reflected the amber glow of the table lamps Margaret had left burning. The familiar scent of lavender and old wood seemed to calm the teenager's trembling, though her eyes darted nervously around the living room, taking in the antique furniture and framed photographs that covered every available surface. "Let's get you out of those wet clothes," Margaret said, her voice softer now that they were inside. "I'll find you something warm to wear." The girl remained frozen by the door, clutching her backpack against her chest like a shield. "I don't want to be any trouble. Maybe I should just—" "Nonsense." Margaret's tone brooked no argument. "You're staying the night, and that's final. What's your name, dear?" A long pause stretched between them before the girl whispered, "Emma." Something about the way she said it made Margaret wonder if it was true, but she simply nodded. "Well, Emma, I'm Margaret. Now let's get you settled." As Margaret climbed the stairs to fetch clothes from her late daughter's room, a room she'd kept unchanged for 30 years, she felt an odd stirring in her chest. The floorboards creaked beneath her feet, each sound echoing through the quiet house like a heartbeat returning to life. She paused outside Sarah's door, her hand resting on the brass knob she'd polished countless times but rarely turned. The room beyond was frozen in time. A canopy bed with yellow curtains, stuffed animals arranged on shelves, and clothes still hanging in the closet. Margaret selected a soft sweater and comfortable pants, trying not to think about how Sarah would never wear them, would never bring home a baby of her own. When she returned downstairs, Emma was examining the photographs on the mantelpiece. Her fingers hovered over a particular frame, a young woman with dark hair and kind eyes holding a diploma. "Your daughter?" Emma asked. "Yes, Sarah." Margaret's voice caught slightly. "She would have been about your age when that was taken." Emma's hand dropped to her side. "Would have been?" "She died in a car accident when she was 22. The words came out matter-of-factly, the way they always did after 3 decades of practice. "That was 30 years ago. I'm sorry." Emma's voice was barely audible. "I lost my mom too. Last year." The shared grief hung between them, like a bridge neither had expected to find. Margaret handed over the clothes, their fingers brushing briefly in the exchange. "The bathroom is just down the hall. Take your time." While Emma changed, Margaret busied herself in the kitchen, heating soup and making tea. The familiar motions calmed her, though her mind raced with questions. Where had this girl come from? Where was the baby's father? Did she have any family looking for her? Emma emerged wearing Sarah's clothes, which fit surprisingly well despite the 30-year age difference. Her dark hair hung in damp waves around her shoulders, and without the heavy coat, her pregnancy was more pronounced. She looked impossibly young and vulnerable, standing in the doorway as if she might bolt at any moment. "Feeling warmer?" Margaret asked, ladling soup into a bowl. Emma nodded and accepted the meal gratefully, eating with the desperate hunger of someone who hadn't had a proper meal in days. Margaret sipped her tea and watched, remembering another young woman who used to sit at this same table, chattering about her dreams and plans for the future. "How far along are you?" Margaret asked gently. 7 months. Emma's spoon paused halfway to her mouth. "It's a girl. Do you have a name picked out?" Emma's eyes filled with tears. "I was thinking, hope. My mom always said that was the most important thing to hold on to." Margaret felt her throat tighten. "Your mother sounds like a wise woman." She was. Emma wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. "She would have helped me figure this out. But now you're doing it on your own." Margaret reached across the table and covered Emma's hand with her own. "That takes incredible strength. I don't feel strong. I feel scared and lost, and completely unprepared to be someone's mother. I think that's how most mothers feel, dear. The love comes first and the rest follows." Emma studied Margaret's face with an intensity that was almost unsettling. "Why are you helping me? You don't even know me." Margaret considered the question, surprised by how difficult it was to answer. "Maybe because someone should have helped you before tonight. Maybe because this old house has been too quiet for too long." She paused, then added more softly, "Or maybe because you remind me of someone I loved very much." Outside, the wind howled against the windows, but inside, two broken souls began the delicate process of mending, unaware that their meeting would soon unravel secrets that had been buried for decades. The morning light filtered through Margaret's lace curtains, casting delicate shadows across the hardwood floor. She had been awake since 5, her usual time, but this morning felt different. The house held a new energy, a presence she hadn't experienced in decades. Down the hall, behind the closed door of what had once been her daughter's room, a stranger slept. Margaret moved quietly through her morning routine, preparing tea with extra care. She selected her finest china, the Spode set that had been her mother's, and arranged shortbread cookies on a matching plate. Her hands trembled slightly as she worked, though whether from age or nerves, she couldn't say. The sound of running water upstairs told her that Emma was awake. Margaret had left fresh towels and one of her own nightgowns outside the bathroom door, along with a note explaining where to find everything. She wondered if the girl would accept these small kindnesses or bolt at the first opportunity. 20 minutes later, Emma appeared at the kitchen doorway, hesitant as a wild animal testing the safety of an offered hand. Margaret's nightgown hung loose on her small frame, the soft blue cotton making her look even younger than her 17 years. Her dark hair was damp from the shower, and Margaret noticed how it brought out the green in her eyes. "I made tea," Margaret said, gesturing to the set table, "and there are eggs if you'd like them." Emma's stomach answered before she could, growling audibly in the quiet kitchen. A flush crept up her neck. "I should probably get going soon. I don't want to impose." "Nonsense. Sit." Margaret's tone brooked no argument, the same voice she'd once used to corral unruly students. "The roads won't be cleared for hours yet." As if to emphasize her point, the wind howled against the windows, rattling the glass. Emma moved to the table, her hand unconsciously resting on her rounded belly. Margaret pretended not to notice, busying herself with scrambling eggs and buttering toast. "How far along are you?" Margaret asked gently, setting a full plate before the girl. Emma's fork paused halfway to her mouth. 6 months. The words were barely a whisper. "And the father, gone." Emma's voice hardened. He made it real clear he wanted nothing to do with this. Margaret poured herself more tea, her movements deliberate and calm. "What about your family?" Emma's laugh was bitter. "My mom kicked me out when she found out, said I was a disgrace, that she couldn't have people at church knowing." She took a large bite of eggs, clearly trying to end the conversation. But Margaret had spent 40 years drawing stories from reluctant teenagers. She recognized the pain behind Emma's defiant facade, the way hurt could masquerade as anger. "Where have you been staying?" "Here and there. I've got some money saved from my job at the diner, but—" Emma shrugged, the gesture trying to convey nonchalance but failing. "Winter makes everything harder." "You mentioned college," Margaret said. "What were you planning to study?" Emma's face brightened for the first time since arriving. "Education. I want to teach elementary school." "Wanted," she corrected, her expression dimming again. "That's not exactly an option now." "Why not?" "Come on." Emma gestured to her belly. "Single mom? No family support? No money for school? I'll be lucky to finish high school." Margaret felt something stir in her chest, a fierce protectiveness she hadn't experienced in years. "You're 17, not 70. Your life isn't over." "Easy to say when it's not your life falling apart." "I had a daughter once," Margaret said quietly. "She was about your age when she died. Emma's fork clattered against her plate. I'm sorry. I didn't know. Cancer. Leukemia. She fought for 2 years. Margaret's voice remained steady, though her hands tightened around her teacup. Sarah wanted to be a teacher too. She used to say that teachers were the ones who could change the world, one child at a time. The kitchen fell silent, except for the wind outside and the gentle tick of the grandfather clock in the hallway. Emma finished her breakfast slowly, and Margaret could see her processing this information, trying to understand why this stranger was sharing something so personal. Why are you telling me this? Emma finally asked. Margaret met her eyes directly. Because sometimes the universe puts people in our path for a reason, and sometimes the best way to honor those we've lost is to help those who are still fighting. Margaret padded downstairs in her slippers, the familiar creaks of the old house greeting her like an old friend. In the kitchen, she started the coffee maker and began pulling ingredients from the pantry. Pancakes seemed appropriate, comforting, substantial food for someone who clearly hadn't been eating well. The girl emerged just as Margaret was flipping the second batch, her dark hair tangled and her clothes wrinkled from sleep. She moved cautiously, one hand instinctively protective over her belly, eyes darting around the kitchen as if memorizing escape routes. Good morning, Margaret said, keeping her voice gentle. I hope you slept well. Yeah, thanks. The girl's voice was hoarse. She remained standing near the doorway, poised for flight. Look, I really appreciate what you did, but I should probably get going. Margaret glanced toward the window where snow continued to fall steadily. In this weather? The roads won't be plowed for hours, and even then it's dangerous. Sit down, have some breakfast. I don't want to be any trouble. You're not trouble, dear. You're company. Margaret set a plate of steaming pancakes on the small kitchen table. I haven't cooked for anyone but myself in 15 years. It's rather nice, actually. The girl hesitated, then slowly approached the table. The smell of food seemed to override her caution, and she sat down carefully. Thank you, she whispered, cutting into the pancakes with the reverence of someone who hadn't had a proper meal in days. Margaret poured herself coffee and sat across from her unexpected guest. I'm Margaret Walsh. I've lived in this house for 43 years. Emma, the girl replied between bites. Emma Morrison. The name hit Margaret like a physical blow. Her coffee cup rattled against the saucer as she set it down, and she felt the blood drain from her face. Morrison. After all these years, that name still had the power to stop her heart. Morrison, she repeated, her voice barely steady. That's not a common name around here. Emma looked up, fork halfway to her mouth. My mom's family was from this area, but she never talked about it much, said she wanted to leave the past behind. Margaret's hands trembled as she reached for her coffee again. What was your mother's name? Sarah. Sarah Morrison. Emma paused, studying Margaret's face. Are you okay? You look like you've seen a ghost. Margaret felt as though she had. Sarah Morrison. Little Sarah with the wild blonde curls and defiant green eyes, the girl who had stormed out of this very house 37 years ago, screaming that she never wanted to see Margaret again. The daughter who had kept her promise. I knew your mother, Margaret said quietly. Emma's fork clattered to her plate. You knew my mom? But that's impossible. She said she didn't have any family left, that everyone was dead. The words cut deep, but Margaret supposed she deserved them. In Sarah's mind, maybe she was dead. Maybe they all were. We had a falling out many years ago. She was very young, about your age, actually. What kind of falling out? Emma's voice had grown suspicious, wary. It's complicated, she said finally. Families often are. Were you friends? Neighbors? Margaret turned back to face her granddaughter, though Emma didn't know that yet. The girl's eyes held Sarah's same intensity, the same stubborn set to her jaw that Margaret remembered so well. But there was something else there too, a vulnerability that Sarah had never allowed herself to show. We were close once, Margaret said carefully. Very close. What happened to her? Your mother? Emma's face crumpled slightly. Cancer. 3 years ago, it was just the two of us, and then it was just me. She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. "She never mentioned you, Mrs. Walsh. I'm sorry." Margaret nodded, unable to trust her voice. Sarah was gone. The daughter she had driven away with her harsh words and impossible expectations was gone, and there would never be a chance to make things right. But here sat Sarah's daughter, pregnant and alone, carrying Margaret's great-grandchild. "I'm sorry for your loss," Margaret managed. "She was a remarkable girl." "Yeah, she was." Emma pushed the pancakes around her plate. "I just wish she'd told me more about where she came from. I feel so lost sometimes, like I'm missing pieces of myself." Margaret returned to the table, her mind racing. "Perhaps I can help you find some of those pieces." The morning light filtering through the kitchen curtains revealed the storm's aftermath, a world transformed into crystalline silence. Margaret stood at the window, watching ice-laden branches catch the early sun like prisms, while behind her came the soft sounds of Sarah stirring awake on the living room couch. 3 days had passed since she'd brought the girl inside, and already the house felt different, lighter somehow, despite the weight of unspoken questions that hung between them. Sarah had shared precious little about herself, only her first name, her age of 17, and the fact that she was roughly 6 months along. Everything else remained locked behind those guarded green eyes. Margaret turned as Sarah appeared in the doorway, her dark hair tousled from sleep, one hand resting protectively over her rounded belly. The girl had finally accepted the loan of Margaret's old nightgown, though she still clutched her jacket, like a security blanket during the day. "Morning, dear. How you feeling?" "Better, thank you." Sarah's voice carried the careful politeness of someone unaccustomed to kindness. "I should probably get going soon. The roads must be clear by now." "Going where exactly?" Margaret kept her tone gentle but direct. She'd learned over 8 decades that dancing around difficult topics rarely solved anything. Sarah's silence stretched between them like a taut wire. Margaret began preparing breakfast, the familiar rhythm of cracking eggs and buttering toast, giving her hands something to do while she waited. "I have a car," Sarah finally said. "Yes, I saw it. Barely running by the sound of it, and certainly no place for someone in your condition." Margaret slid scrambled eggs onto 2 plates. "Sit down, you're eating for 2. Something in Margaret's no-nonsense tone seemed to crack Sarah's defensive shell just slightly. She lowered herself carefully into a kitchen chair, accepting the plate with a whispered, "Thank you." Sarah's fork clattered against her plate, her face went pale, and for a moment Margaret thought she might bolt entirely. Instead, she pressed her lips together and shook her head. "I can't." "Can't or won't? Does it matter?" Sarah's voice cracked slightly. "You've been kind to me, Mrs. Holloway, kinder than I deserve, but some things are better left buried." Margaret studied the girl's face, noting the stubborn set of her jaw that reminded her of someone, though she couldn't place who. "Are you running from someone dangerous?" "No, not dangerous, just—" Sarah struggled for words, disappointed, angry. People who made it very clear I wasn't welcome anymore. The familiar ache of old wounds stirred in Margaret's chest. She knew something about family disappointment, about doors slammed shut by people who should have offered shelter instead. Her own daughter's face flashed through her memory, Elizabeth, with her pinched mouth and cold eyes during their last argument 15 years ago. "Family," Margaret said quietly. It wasn't a question. Sarah nodded, tears threatening at the corners of her eyes. "Well then." Margaret rose and began clearing the breakfast dishes with brisk efficiency. "I suppose you'll be staying longer than originally planned. I can't impose on you like that. You don't even know me." Margaret paused in her cleaning, hands stilling on the dish towel. "No, I don't. But I know what it's like to have nowhere to go. I know what it feels like when the people who should love you unconditionally decide you're too much trouble to bother with." She turned back to Sarah, her expression softening. "And I know what it's like to spend decades regretting the chances you didn't take to help someone who needed it." Sarah's tears spilled over then, quiet and defeated. "Why are you doing this?" Maybe because this old house has been too quiet for too long, she said finally. Maybe because I'm tired of living with ghosts. She sat back down across from Sarah. Or maybe because sometimes the universe puts exactly the right person in your path at exactly the right moment, and it would be foolish to ignore the gift. Sarah wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. What if I'm not a gift? What if I'm just trouble? Margaret reached across the table and covered Sarah's hand with her own weathered fingers. Then we'll figure it out together. But first, you're going to finish your breakfast, and then we're going to set up the spare bedroom properly. The couch was fine for a few nights, but you need a real bed. For the first time since Margaret had found her, Sarah's smile looked genuinely hopeful. The old photograph trembled in Margaret's weathered hands as she stared at the familiar handwriting on the back. For my darling Margaret, until we meet again, all my love, James. The ink had faded to a pale blue, but the words still cut through her heart like a blade. That's him, isn't it? Lily's voice was barely a whisper from where she sat on the edge of the bed. The man in my dreams. James Morrison, the love of her life, the father of the child she'd given away. Tell me about him, Lily said, her hand instinctively moving to her rounded belly. Please, I need to know. Margaret set the photograph on the nightstand with shaking fingers. Outside, the storm had finally begun to subside, but inside the small bedroom, another kind of tempest was brewing. She looked at Lily's young face, so eager and desperate for answers, and saw herself at 17, scared, alone, and drowning in secrets. He was 22 when I met him, Margaret began, her voice hoarse with emotion. I was just 17, working at my father's grocery store. He'd come in every Tuesday and Friday, always buying the same things, a loaf of bread, a jar of peanut butter, and a bottle of milk. He was studying to be a teacher. Lily leaned forward, hanging on every word. He had the most beautiful smile, Margaret continued, lost now in the memory, and these eyes that seemed to see right through to your soul. We started talking, little conversations at first. Then he began staying longer, helping me stock shelves when my father wasn't looking. The old woman paused, remembering the electricity she'd felt whenever James's hand had brushed hers, the way her heart would race when she heard the bell above the door chime on Tuesdays and Fridays. We fell in love, she said simply. Deeply, completely, foolishly in love. But it was 1961. And I was the daughter of the town's most prominent businessman. He was from the wrong side of the tracks, working 3 jobs to pay for college. My father would never have approved. So you kept it secret, Lily said, understanding flickering in her eyes. Margaret nodded. We met in hidden places, the old barn behind the Methodist church, the walking trail by Miller's Creek. For 6 months we lived in our own little world, making plans for a future we thought we'd have together. She reached for the photograph again, tracing James's face with her fingertip. He'd been so handsome, so full of hope and dreams. They'd talked about the house they'd buy, the children they'd have, the life they'd build together once he finished school and could provide for a family. What happened? Lily asked, though her tone suggested she already suspected the answer wouldn't be happy. I got pregnant, Margaret said, the words falling like stones into still water. And when my father found out about James, about us, he made sure James left town, permanently. The room fell silent except for the steady drip of melting snow from the eaves outside. Margaret could see Lily processing this information, connecting dots that formed a picture neither of them wanted to see clearly. He threatened him, Margaret continued, needing to tell the whole truth now that she'd started. My father had influence, connections. He could have destroyed James's future with a single phone call to the college, to potential employers. He gave James a choice, leave town and never contact me again or watch his dreams crumble. And he left, Lily said quietly. He left, Margaret confirmed, though the words tasted bitter even after all these years. But not before writing me a letter explaining everything. I never got to read it until after my father died 15 years later. By then, it was too late. She stood up slowly, her arthritic joints protesting, and walked to the window. The storm clouds were breaking apart, revealing patches of star-studded sky. "I gave birth to a daughter," she said without turning around. "Sarah. I was sent away to a home for unwed mothers, told to give her up for adoption. My father arranged everything. A nice family," he said, "people who could provide for her properly." Behind her, she heard Lily's sharp intake of breath. "I held her for exactly 10 minutes before they took her away," Margaret continued, her voice breaking. 10 minutes to memorize her face, to whisper that I loved her, to promise I'd never forget her. She turned back to face Lily, tears streaming down both their faces now. "I spent 60 years wondering what happened to her, whether she was happy, whether she ever thought about me. And now you're here, and you're having dreams about a man you've never met, and I'm starting to believe that some connections transcend time and blood and all the barriers we think separate us." The storm had passed, leaving behind a crystalline world that sparkled under the morning sun. Margaret stood at her kitchen window, watching Emma trudge through the snow toward the mailbox, her borrowed coat too large and her movements careful on the icy ground. 3 days had settled into an unexpected rhythm between them, but Margaret could sense the girl's restlessness growing with each passing hour. The telephone's shrill ring cut through her thoughts. Margaret hesitated, her hand hovering over the receiver. Since Emma's arrival, she'd let the answering machine handle most calls, afraid of questions she wasn't ready to answer. "Mom?" Her daughter Linda's voice crackled through the speaker. "I know you're there. Pick up the phone." Margaret sighed and lifted the receiver. "Hello, Linda. Finally. I've been calling for days. Are you all right? The news said you had terrible weather up there." "I'm fine, dear. Just a little snow." "A little snow? They're calling it the worst storm in 20 years. I was worried sick." Linda's voice carried that familiar edge of exasperation mixed with genuine concern. "I was thinking of driving up to check on you." Margaret's grip tightened on the phone. "That's not necessary. The roads are still quite bad." "Mum, you're 82 years old, living alone in that big house. What if something had happened? What if you'd fallen, or lost power, or—" "Linda, please." Margaret watched Emma making her way back up the driveway, one hand pressed to her lower back. "I'm perfectly capable of taking care of myself." "Absolutely not." The words came out sharper than Margaret intended. "Mom, be reasonable. You're isolated up there, especially in winter. At Sunset Manor, you'd have people around, activities, medical care right on site." "I said no, Linda. This is my home." Through the window, Margaret saw Emma pause at the porch steps, her face pale and drawn. The girl had been pushing herself too hard, helping with household tasks, despite Margaret's protests that she should rest. "We're not talking about tomorrow," Linda continued, oblivious to her mother's distraction, "but soon. Maybe this spring, when the weather's better for moving. You could visit first, see how nice it is." "I have to go." Margaret's voice was firm. "Emma needs me." "Emma? Who's Emma?" The words had slipped out before Margaret could stop them. She closed her eyes, cursing her carelessness. "A friend. She's visiting. You didn't mention having company. Is she someone from town?" "Linda, I really must go. We'll talk later." "Mom, wait." Margaret hung up the phone just as Emma entered through the back door, stamping snow from her boots. The girl's cheeks were flushed with cold, but there was something else in her expression, a tightness around her eyes that hadn't been there earlier. "Everything all right?" Margaret asked, though she could see clearly that it wasn't. Emma held up a handful of mail, her fingers trembling slightly. "There was a police car parked down the road. The officer looked at me when I walked by." Margaret felt her stomach drop. "Did he say anything?" "No, but he was watching, and there was someone with him, a woman in a social services jacket." Emma's voice was barely above a whisper. "They're looking for me, aren't they?" Margaret moved to the window and peered down the road. She could just make out the tail end of a dark sedan disappearing around the bend. Her mind raced through possibilities. None of them good. "Sit down," she said gently, guiding Emma to the kitchen table. "Tell me exactly what happened." "I was getting the mail like always, and I heard voices. When I looked up, There was this police car just sitting there. The officer rolled down his window and asked if I lived here. I said I was just helping a friend, and he nodded. But then the woman leaned over and asked my age. Emma's hands moved protectively to her belly. I told them I had to go, and I walked back as normal as I could, but my heart was pounding so hard I thought they'd hear it. Margaret reached across the table and covered Emma's cold hands with her own warm ones. The girl was shaking now, and not from the cold. "We need to make some decisions," Margaret said quietly. "Both of us." Emma looked up, her eyes wide with fear and something else, a desperate hope that maybe, somehow, there was still a way forward that didn't involve running again. "What kind of decisions?" Margaret squeezed her hands gently. "The kind that can't be undone." The photograph trembled in Margaret's weathered hands as she stared at the face that had haunted her dreams for decades. Thomas looked so young in the picture, barely 25, his dark eyes holding the same intensity she remembered from their stolen moments together. But it was the woman beside him that made her breath catch. Eleanor, her sister, radiant in her wedding dress. "Where did you find this?" Margaret whispered, her voice barely audible above the crackling fire. Sarah shifted uncomfortably on the couch, one hand resting protectively on her growing belly. "It was in my grandmother's things. She left me a box before she died, said I should open it when I needed answers most." She paused, studying Margaret's pale face. "She told me stories about her sister Margaret, but I never thought." "Eleanor was your grandmother." It wasn't a question. Margaret sank into her armchair, the photograph falling to her lap. Sweet, beautiful Eleanor. She always got everything she wanted, including Thomas. The name hung between them like a prayer and a curse. Margaret closed her eyes, transported back to that summer of 1962 when the world seemed full of endless possibilities. She'd been 18, Eleanor 22, both of them drawn to the charismatic young man who'd come to town to work at their father's lumber mill. "I loved him first," Margaret said finally. "We met at the church social. He was different from the other boys, worldly, mysterious. He'd traveled, seen places I could only dream about." She opened her eyes, meeting Sarah's expectant gaze. But Eleanor always had a way of getting what she wanted. She was older, more sophisticated. When she set her sights on Thomas, what happened? Margaret stood abruptly, walking to the window where snow continued to fall in thick, silent sheets. Eleanor was engaged to Robert Henley, the banker's son. Everyone expected it, but she broke it off for Thomas, caused quite the scandal. Her reflection stared back at her, ghostly in the glass. What no one knew was that Thomas and I had been meeting in secret for months. Sarah's sharp intake of breath made Margaret turn. "You were having an affair." "We were young and foolish and desperately in love." The words came easier now, as if a dam had finally burst. "Thomas wanted to tell Eleanor, to make things right, but I begged him not to. I couldn't bear the thought of losing my sister over a man, even if that man meant everything to me. So, you let her marry him?" "I thought I was doing the noble thing." Margaret's laugh was bitter. "I convinced myself that stepping aside was the right choice, that love meant sacrifice. Thomas fought me on it, said we should run away together, start fresh somewhere else." Sarah struggled to her feet, moving closer. "But you didn't." "No. I watched my sister marry the man I loved, smiled through the ceremony, gave a toast at the reception." Margaret's voice cracked. "And then I left town the next day, moved to Chicago, got a job, tried to build a life without him. Did you ever see him again?" The question Margaret had been dreading hung in the air. She returned to her chair, picking up the photograph with trembling fingers. "Once. About a year later he found me in Chicago, said he'd made a terrible mistake, that Eleanor knew he didn't love her the way he should. He wanted us to be together. Consequences be damned. What did you say?" I turned him away. The words tasted like ash. "Eleanor was pregnant by then, with your father. I couldn't destroy a family, couldn't be responsible for taking a child's father away." Sarah sank back onto the couch, her face pale. "So grandfather never knew? About us?" "I thought not." Margaret studied the photograph again, noticing details she'd missed before. The way Thomas's smile didn't quite reach his eyes, how his hand rested stiffly on Eleanor's shoulder. But looking at this picture now, seeing it among Eleanor's things, perhaps she knew more than she let on. "There's something else," Sarah said quietly, reaching into the box beside her. "A letter. It's addressed to you." Margaret's heart stopped as Sarah handed her an envelope, yellowed with age, her name written in Eleanor's familiar script. With shaking hands, she opened it, unfolding pages covered in her sister's careful handwriting. The first line made her gasp. "Dearest Margaret, if you're reading this, then Sarah has found you, just as I hoped she would." As Margaret read on, tears began to fall. Eleanor had known everything. About the secret meetings, the sacrifice, the love that had shaped all their lives. But it was the final paragraph that shattered her completely. "Thomas never stopped loving you, Maggie. Even in his final days, your name was on his lips. The greatest tragedy of our marriage wasn't that he didn't love me. It was that I kept him from the woman who could have made him whole." Sarah watched in silence as Margaret wept for the life that might have been, for the love that had slipped through her fingers like snow. The manila envelope sat between them on the kitchen table like an unexploded bomb. Margaret's hands trembled as she reached for it, then pulled back, as if touching it might make everything real in a way she wasn't prepared for. "Where did you find this?" she whispered, her voice barely audible above the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway. Emma shifted uncomfortably in her chair, one hand instinctively moving to her growing belly. "It was in the glove compartment, hidden under some old registration papers. I wasn't snooping, I swear. I was just looking for something to write on. And when I pulled out the papers, this fell out." Margaret stared at the envelope, her maiden name written across it in her daughter Sarah's careful handwriting. Sarah, who had died 3 years ago without ever mentioning this letter, without ever explaining why she'd kept it hidden all these years. "What does it say?" Margaret asked, though part of her already knew she didn't want the answer. Emma's eyes filled with tears. "Maybe you should read it yourself." But Margaret couldn't move. The arthritis in her fingers seemed suddenly worse, and the weight of her 82 years pressed down on her shoulders like a heavy coat. "Please," she said, "read it to me." Emma carefully opened the envelope and unfolded the letter inside. Her voice shook as she began to read. "Mom, if you're reading this, then Emma has found her way to you, just like I always hoped she would. I know you're probably angry with me for keeping this secret, but I need you to understand why I never told you about her." Margaret's breath caught in her throat. She gripped the edge of the table, her knuckles white. Emma continued, her voice growing stronger. "When I was 17, I made a mistake. I got pregnant, and I was so scared of disappointing you and Dad that I couldn't tell you. You'd already sacrificed so much for me, worked 2 jobs to keep me in school, and I couldn't bear to see the look in your eyes when you found out I'd thrown it all away." The room seemed to spin around Margaret. Sarah, pregnant at 17. Sarah, who had gone to stay with Margaret's sister Helen that summer, claiming she wanted to help with Helen's new baby. Sarah, who had come home quieter, more withdrawn, but Margaret had attributed it to teenage moodiness. "I stayed with Aunt Helen," Emma read on, "and when the baby was born, I gave her up for adoption. I thought it was the right thing to do. I thought I was giving her a better life than I could provide. But not a day has gone by that I haven't thought about her, wondered if she was happy, if she was safe, if she knew she was loved." Margaret felt tears streaming down her cheeks. All those years, Sarah had carried this burden alone. All those times Margaret had wondered why her daughter seemed distant, why she'd never married, never had children of her own, the guilt she must have carried. Emma's voice broke as she continued. "I hired a private investigator last year to find her. Her name is Emma Rose Thompson. She's 19 now, and Mom, she looks just like you did at that age. I've been watching her from a distance, making sure she's okay, but I've never had the courage to approach her. I don't know if I ever will." The investigator told me that Emma's adoptive parents died in a car accident when she was 16, Emma read, her voice barely a whisper now. "She's been in and out of foster homes since then. Mom, she needs family. She needs us." but I'm too much of a coward to reach out to her. If something happens to me, if you're reading this because I'm gone, please find her. Please tell her she's loved. Please give her the family I was too scared to give her myself." The letter ended with Sarah's signature and a date from just 6 months before her sudden heart attack. Margaret stood up slowly, her chair scraping against the kitchen floor. She walked around the table and pulled Emma into her arms, holding her granddaughter close, breathing in the scent of her hair, feeling the solid reality of her presence. "She loved you," Margaret whispered. "She loved you so much she spent years making sure you were safe, even from a distance." Emma sobbed against Margaret's shoulder. "I wish I could have met her. I wish she had been brave enough to tell me herself." Margaret pulled back and cupped Emma's face in her hands. "She was brave enough to love you. And she was wise enough to know that sometimes love means waiting for the right moment. You found your way to me during that snowstorm for a reason. Sarah knew you would." The manila envelope felt heavier than it should have as Margaret held it with trembling fingers. Emma sat beside her on the couch, her growing belly a gentle curve beneath the soft sweater Margaret had bought her just last week. The afternoon light filtered through the lace curtains, casting delicate shadows across the living room where so many family secrets had been buried for decades. "Are you sure you want me here for this?" Emma asked softly, her hand instinctively moving to rest on her stomach. At 7 months pregnant, she had developed a protective habit of cradling her unborn child whenever tension filled the air. Margaret nodded, though her throat felt dry as sandpaper. "You're family now, dear, and this affects you too, in ways you don't yet understand." The envelope bore the return address of Whitmore and Associates, the private investigation firm Margaret had contacted 3 weeks ago. She had given them one simple task: find out everything they could about the car accident that had claimed her daughter Sarah's life 23 years ago. The official report had always felt incomplete, sanitized, as if crucial details had been deliberately omitted. Emma reached over and gently squeezed Margaret's free hand. The gesture was so natural, so full of the kind of love Margaret had thought she'd lost forever, that it gave her the courage to break the seal. Inside were photocopied police reports, witness statements, and a handwritten note from the investigator. Margaret's eyes scanned the pages, her breath catching as she read details that had never appeared in the sanitized version she'd been given all those years ago. "What does it say?" Emma whispered. Margaret's voice came out as barely more than a breath. Sarah wasn't alone in the car that night. The words hung in the air like a physical presence. Emma shifted closer, her young face creased with concern as she watched Margaret's complexion drain of color. "There was a passenger," Margaret continued, her finger tracing the lines of text as if she couldn't quite believe them. "A young man named David Chen. He was thrown from the vehicle on impact." Her hands began to shake more violently. "Emma, he survived." The room fell silent, except for the gentle ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner. Emma's eyes widened as the implications began to settle in. "Mrs. Margaret, that means there was a witness to what really happened that night." Margaret set the papers down carefully, as if they might shatter. "Someone who could have told me whether Sarah suffered, whether she said anything in those final moments." Her voice cracked. "Someone who's been alive all these years while I've been talking to a gravestone." Emma's pregnancy had made her more emotional, more attuned to the pain of others, and tears began to well in her eyes. "Why didn't anyone tell you? Why isn't he mentioned in the report you were given?" Margaret picked up the investigator's handwritten note, her reading glasses sliding down her nose. According to this, David Chen was listed as a John Doe, initially because he was unconscious and had no identification. By the time he woke up in the hospital 3 days later, the case had already been closed. The officer who took his statement filed it as a supplemental report, but— She paused, rereading the line. "But it was never forwarded to the family because of departmental oversight." "Departmental oversight," Emma repeated, her voice tight with indignation. "That's not oversight. That's negligence." Margaret felt something she hadn't experienced in years. a burning anger that cut through her grief like a blade. For more than 2 decades, she had accepted the sparse details, the clinical language, the sense that Sarah's death was just another statistic. She had carried the weight of unanswered questions, wondering if her daughter had been afraid, if she had called out for her mother, if there had been anything that could have been done differently. "The note says he still lives in Portland," Margaret said, her voice growing stronger with each word. "David Chen. He's a teacher now, married with children of his own." She looked up at Emma, and for the first time since opening the envelope, her eyes held a spark of determination rather than just pain. "He's been 3 hours away this entire time." Emma leaned back against the couch cushions, one hand still protectively over her belly. "What are you going to do?" Margaret carefully gathered the papers, arranging them in a neat stack. The trembling in her hands had stopped, replaced by a steady resolve that surprised her. "I'm going to Portland. I'm going to find David Chen, and I'm going to ask him to tell me about my daughter's last moments." The afternoon light had shifted, casting longer shadows across the room. Outside, the first snow of the season had begun to fall, each flake catching the light like tiny stars. Margaret watched it for a moment, remembering another snowy night when a scared young woman had changed her life forever. "When do we leave?" Emma asked quietly. Margaret turned to her, eyebrows raised in surprise. "We? You said I was family now," Emma replied with a gentle smile that reminded Margaret so much of Sarah it took her breath away. "Family doesn't let family face the past alone." The manila envelope felt heavier than it should have as Margaret's trembling fingers broke the seal. Sarah sat beside her on the couch, close enough that their knees touched, both women holding their breath as the contents spilled onto the coffee table. Birth certificates, hospital records, a death certificate that made Margaret's heart skip, and there, at the bottom of the pile, a photograph that stopped time entirely. Sarah reached for it first, her young fingers careful with the aged paper. "Is this—" "That's my daughter," Margaret whispered, her voice barely audible. "That's Elizabeth." Sarah's hands shook as she studied the photograph. "But I don't understand. My mother's name was Catherine Mills." Margaret reached for one of the documents with movements that felt underwater. The birth certificate was faded but legible. Baby girl Henderson, born March 15, 1962. Mother, Elizabeth Margaret Henderson. Father, unknown. "She changed her name," Margaret said, pieces of the puzzle clicking into place with painful clarity. "After she left home, she became Catherine Mills, but she was Elizabeth Henderson when she had her first baby." "First baby?" Sarah's voice cracked. Margaret's finger traced down to another line on the certificate. "Twin B, baby girl Henderson, born March 15, 1962, the same date, just minutes apart." The silence stretched between them, heavy with implications neither wanted to voice. Finally, Sarah found her courage. "Where is she? The other baby?" Margaret closed her eyes, remembering that terrible spring when Elizabeth had disappeared for months, returning hollow-eyed and broken, refusing to speak about where she'd been or what had happened. The fights had been epic, accusations flying like shrapnel between them until Elizabeth packed her bags one final time and walked out of Margaret's life forever. "I don't know," Margaret admitted. "Elizabeth never told me about any babies. I suspected something had happened during those months she was gone, but she wouldn't talk to me. We were both so angry, so stubborn." Sarah set the photograph down carefully, as if it might shatter. "So somewhere out there, I might have a twin sister." "Or had," Margaret said gently, indicating another document. A death certificate dated just 3 days after the birth for baby girl Henderson, twin A, cause of death, respiratory complications. "I'm sorry, sweetheart. I'm so sorry." They sat in the growing dusk, processing the magnitude of what they'd discovered. Margaret felt the weight of decades of missed opportunities, of stubborn pride that had cost her a relationship with her daughter, and the chance to know her granddaughter was alive and struggling in the world. "The private investigator," Margaret said suddenly. "We need to call him back. If Elizabeth used different names, if she had children." Margaret studied Sarah's profile in the lamplight, Seeing Elizabeth so clearly it made her chest ache. But she also saw something Elizabeth had lost along the way, hope, despite everything Sarah had endured, despite being abandoned and afraid. She still believed in the possibility of connection, of family, of love. "Sarah," Margaret said carefully, "I want you to know that whatever we find out, whatever other family might be out there, you have a place here, with me, for as long as you want it." Sarah turned to meet her eyes, and Margaret saw her own loneliness reflected there, along with something else. The same fierce determination that had driven Margaret to build a life on her own terms, to survive loss and heartbreak and keep moving forward. "I'd like that," Sarah said simply. "I'd like that very much." As if responding to their emotional revelation, the baby chose that moment to deliver a particularly vigorous kick. Sarah winced and pressed her hand to her side. "Someone's not happy about all this sitting around," she said with a watery laugh. Margaret reached out tentatively, and Sarah guided her hand to the right spot. The sensation of new life moving beneath her palm was extraordinary, a promise of continuity, of second chances, of the possibility that broken things could be mended. "We're going to figure this out," Margaret said, her voice steady with newfound purpose. "All of it. We're going to find out what happened to Elizabeth, and we're going to make sure this little one has the family they deserve." Sarah nodded, still covering Margaret's hand with her own. Outside, snow began to fall again, but inside the warm circle of lamplight, two hearts that had been broken in different ways began the careful process of healing together. The DNA results arrived on a Tuesday morning, delivered in a plain manila envelope that seemed too ordinary to contain such life-altering information. Margaret's hands trembled as she held it, watching through the kitchen window as Emma fed the chickens in the backyard, her belly now prominently rounded at 6 months. She had ordered the test weeks ago, during one of her sleepless nights when Emma's resemblance to someone from her past had become too haunting to ignore. The curve of her smile, the way she tilted her head when listening, even the particular shade of her auburn hair, it all pointed to a possibility that Margaret had tried to dismiss as an old woman's wishful thinking. But now, with the envelope in her hands, she wasn't sure she was ready for the truth. Emma's laughter drifted through the window as one of the hens pecked at her shoelaces. The sound had become as familiar as her own heartbeat over these months. This girl who had stumbled into her life during a snowstorm had filled corners of loneliness Margaret hadn't even realized existed. The kitchen door opened with its familiar creak. "Mrs. Murphy, you should see how big Henrietta's getting. I think she might be broody." Emma paused, noticing the envelope. "What's that?" Margaret quickly slipped it into her apron pocket. "Just bills, dear. Nothing important." But Emma's eyes, sharp despite her youth, caught the tension in Margaret's voice. "Are you okay? You look pale." "I'm fine. Just tired." Margaret busied herself at the sink, scrubbing dishes that were already clean. "Why don't you rest? Dr. Peterson said you need to take it easy." Emma didn't move. Instead, she walked closer, her bare feet silent on the worn linoleum. "You've been acting strange lately, staring at me when you think I'm not looking, asking odd questions about my family." Margaret's hands stilled in the soapy water. She had been asking questions, careful, probing inquiries about Emma's mother, her grandmother, anyone who might connect to the daughter Margaret had given up 43 years ago. The daughter she'd never stopped thinking about, never stopped wondering if she was safe, happy, loved. "I've told you everything I know," Emma continued, settling into the kitchen chair with the careful movements of pregnancy. "My mom died when I was 12. Before that, it was just us. She never talked about her family, said they didn't want anything to do with us." The glass Margaret was washing slipped from her fingers, shattering against the porcelain sink. Blood bloomed in the water as a shard cut her palm. "Oh!" Emma struggled to her feet. "Let me help." "No, stay back!" Margaret's voice was sharper than intended. She wrapped her hand in a dish towel, her mind spinning. The timing fit. Her daughter would be 43 now, old enough to have had Emma when she was young herself. The location fit too. Margaret had always wondered if her daughter had stayed in the general area. Mrs. Murphy, what's going on? Emma's voice carried a note of hurt. Ever since that lawyer came by last week asking questions about me, you've been acting like I'm some kind of mystery to solve. Margaret's blood ran cold. What lawyer? The one who said he was working on a case involving runaway teens. He had a picture of my mom from when she was young. Asked if I recognized her. Emma's brow furrowed. I thought you knew about it. He said he'd spoken to people in town. The envelope in Margaret's pocket seemed to burn against her hip. She pulled it out with shaking hands, her cut palms staining the manila paper red. Emma, sit down. Something in her tone made the girl comply immediately. Margaret eased into the opposite chair, the envelope between them like a bridge or a chasm. She couldn't tell which. 43 years ago, I made the hardest decision of my life, Margaret began, her voice barely above a whisper. I was young, unmarried, and scared. My parents sent me away to have my baby in secret. They said it was for the best, that the child would have a better life with a proper family. Emma's eyes widened. Ah, Mrs. Murphy. I held her for exactly 10 minutes before they took her away. She had auburn hair and the most beautiful brown eyes. Margaret's voice broke. They wouldn't tell me who adopted her or where she went. Said it was better that way. The silence stretched between them, heavy with implication. Emma's hand moved unconsciously to her belly. The lawyer, Margaret continued, was probably hired by my nephew. He's been trying to track down my family history since his father died. He doesn't know about the baby I gave up. Emma stared at the envelope. What's in there? Answers, Margaret whispered. Or maybe just more questions. Emma reached across the table and covered Margaret's uninjured hand with her own. Whatever it says, it doesn't change anything. You saved my life. You saved both our lives. Margaret looked into those familiar brown eyes and saw her own reflection staring back, the same eyes she'd passed down to a daughter she'd never known, who had passed them down to this remarkable girl who'd found her way home through a snowstorm. With Emma's hand warm against hers, Margaret opened the envelope. The doorbell's chime interrupted her thoughts. Through the frosted glass she could make out a familiar silhouette. Her heart quickened as she opened the door to find Dr. Patricia Wells, the family physician who had delivered both her children and knew every secret the Harper family had ever tried to keep. Patricia Margaret stepped aside to let her in. This is unexpected. I was in the neighborhood. Thought I'd check on you. Patricia's keen eyes swept the living room, taking in the baby books scattered on the coffee table, the prenatal vitamins on the side table. I heard through the grapevine that you've taken in someone. Margaret had forgotten how quickly news traveled in their small town. Emma's a lovely girl who needed help. And she's pregnant. It wasn't a question. Margaret poured tea, her hands steadier than she felt. Yes. Patricia settled into the armchair, her medical bag at her feet. Margaret, I've known you for 40 years. You haven't exactly been maternal since Sarah died. The directness stung, but Margaret had learned to appreciate Patricia's honesty. Things change, do they? Patricia leaned forward. Or are you trying to fix something that can't be fixed? Before Margaret could respond, the front door opened and Emma entered, cheeks flushed from the cold. She stopped short when she saw the stranger, instinctively placing a protective hand over her rounded belly. Emma, this is Dr. Wells, an old friend. Margaret made the introduction carefully. Patricia, this is Emma. Patricia's expression softened as she took in Emma's youth, the wariness in her dark eyes. Hello, dear. How far along are you? 28 weeks, Emma answered quietly, glancing at Margaret for reassurance. And you're receiving proper prenatal care? Emma's silence stretched too long. Margaret felt a familiar tightness in her chest, the same feeling she'd had when Sarah was 18 and secretive, when every conversation felt like walking through a minefield. I've been taking vitamins, Emma finally said. Patricia's professional demeanor sharpened. That's not enough. You need regular checkups, blood work, ultrasounds to make sure the baby is developing properly. I can't afford. "I'll cover it," Margaret interrupted, surprising herself with the firmness in her voice. Emma turned to stare at her. "Margaret, no. You've already done too much. It's settled." Margaret met Patricia's knowing look. "Whatever she needs." After Patricia left with promises to schedule Emma's appointment, the house fell into an uncomfortable silence. Emma sat heavily on the couch, her hands folded over her belly. "You don't have to do this," she said finally. Margaret busied herself collecting the teacups. "Do what?" "Take care of me, pay for everything. I know this isn't what you signed up for when you let me stay the night." The cups clinked against each other as Margaret's hands trembled slightly. "What I signed up for was helping someone who needed it." "But why?" Emma's voice broke slightly. "Why me? Why this much?" "Because," Margaret said slowly, the words feeling like they were being pulled from some deep, buried place, "I once had a daughter who was scared and pregnant and alone. And instead of helping her, I turned her away." Emma's eyes widened. "What happened to her?" "She died. In a car accident, 3 months after I last spoke to her." Margaret's voice was steady, but her hands shook as she pressed them against the back of the chair. "She was coming home, probably to tell me about the baby. It was Christmas Eve." The room seemed to hold its breath. Emma struggled to her feet and crossed to Margaret, her movements careful but determined. "I'm not her," Emma said gently. "I know." Margaret looked into Emma's eyes, seeing compassion there instead of the judgment she'd expected. "But maybe I can be the person I should have been then." Emma reached out tentatively and took Margaret's hands in hers. They were warm and steady, anchoring Margaret to the present moment. "Maybe we can both be different people than we were before," Emma whispered. Outside, the winter sun was setting, painting the snow-covered yard in shades of gold and rose. "That's my grandmother," Sarah whispered, leaning closer from her position on the couch. "Rose Williams. She died when my mom was just 10. Margaret's breath caught in her throat. Rose, the name she had whispered in prayer countless times, begging for forgiveness, for a chance to explain, for just one more conversation. But Rose had vanished from Millfield in 1960, taking with her the secret that had torn their friendship apart and left Margaret drowning in guilt. "Tell me about her," Margaret managed, though her voice sounded foreign to her own ears. Sarah's face lit up despite her exhaustion. "Mom always said Grandma Rose was the strongest woman she ever knew. She became a nurse during the war, worked at the base hospital. After the war, she moved to Chicago, raised my mom all by herself. Mom said she never talked much about her life before Chicago, though. Said it was too painful." The room seemed to spin around Margaret as the pieces of a decades-old puzzle finally clicked into place. The base hospital. The same hospital where Margaret's brother Thomas had been stationed as a medic. The same hospital where he had met a young nurse named Rose, fallen desperately in love, and made promises he would never be able to keep. "Sarah," Margaret's voice was barely above a whisper, "what was your grandmother's maiden name?" "Collins," Sarah replied without hesitation. "Rose Collins. Why do you ask? You look like you've seen a ghost." Margaret closed her eyes, and suddenly she was 19 again, standing in the kitchen of her childhood home, watching her best friend Rose Collins sob as she revealed her pregnancy. Rose, who had believed Thomas would marry her when he returned from his temporary assignment overseas. Rose, who didn't know that Thomas had already married his commanding officer's daughter in a ceremony arranged by their families. Rose, who trusted Margaret to deliver the letter that would explain everything. The letter Margaret had never given her. "Mrs. Chen." Sarah's voice seemed to come from very far away. "Are you all right?" Margaret opened her eyes to find Sarah leaning forward with concern, one hand protectively placed over her rounded belly. The sight of that gesture, so similar to one Rose had made all those years ago, nearly broke Margaret's composure entirely. "I knew her," Margaret said finally. "I knew your grandmother. We were best friends." Sarah's eyes widened. "You knew Grandma Rose? But how is that possible? You never said anything when I told you my name was Williams." "Because I didn't know," Margaret replied, though even as she said it, she realized there had been signs. The stubborn tilt of Sarah's chin when she was determined about something, the way she hummed while she worked, always the same melody Rose used to hum, the fierce independence that had driven her to live in her car rather than accept help from those who might hurt her. "I don't understand," Sarah said. "If you were friends, why didn't she ever mention you? Why didn't you keep in touch?" Margaret felt the weight of 63 years of silence pressing down on her chest. How could she explain the cowardice that had destroyed the most important friendship of her life? How could she tell this brave young woman that her grandmother had left Millfield believing herself abandoned and betrayed, never knowing that the man she loved had tried desperately to reach her? "There was a misunderstanding," Margaret said carefully, "a terrible misunderstanding that I was responsible for. Your grandmother left town believing things that weren't true, and I never got the chance to make it right." Sarah was quiet for a long moment, studying Margaret's face with those dark eyes that were so achingly familiar. When she finally spoke, her voice was gentle. "What kind of misunderstanding?" Margaret looked down at the photograph again, at Rose's young, hopeful face, and felt the familiar ache of regret settle in her chest. But alongside the pain was something else, a glimmer of possibility she hadn't dared to hope for in decades. "Your grandmother was pregnant when she left Millfield," Margaret said quietly. "With your mother." Sarah's sharp intake of breath filled the silence. "Pregnant? But Mom always said her father died in the war before she was born. She said Grandma Rose never told her his name." Margaret nodded slowly, "Because she never knew the truth about what happened to him. And that's my fault." She looked up at Sarah, seeing Rose's courage reflected in her great-granddaughter's eyes. "But maybe, if you're willing to listen, I can finally tell you the story your grandmother never got to hear." The DNA results arrived on a Tuesday morning, delivered in a plain white envelope that seemed to hold the weight of decades. Margaret's hands trembled as she held it, knowing that whatever lay inside would either confirm her growing suspicions or shatter the fragile hope that had been building in her heart. Sarah sat across from her at the kitchen table, her baby daughter sleeping peacefully in her arms. The past few weeks had been a careful dance around the elephant in the room, the undeniable resemblance between Sarah and the faded photographs Margaret kept in her bedroom, the way certain expressions crossed Sarah's face that reminded Margaret so vividly of someone she'd lost long ago. "Are you going to open it?" Sarah asked softly, her voice barely above a whisper. Margaret's fingers worked at the seal, her arthritis making the simple task feel monumental. When she finally extracted the papers, her eyes scanned the technical language until she found the line that mattered: 999.7% probability of biological relationship. The paper fluttered to the table as Margaret's breath caught in her throat. Sarah was her granddaughter. The baby she held, little Emma, was her great-granddaughter. "What does it say?" Sarah leaned forward, though Margaret suspected she already knew. "Your family," Margaret whispered, tears streaming down her weathered cheeks. "You're actually family." The silence that followed was profound, filled with the weight of missed years and the complexity of emotions neither woman had prepared for. Sarah's own eyes filled with tears as she processed what this meant. She wasn't alone in the world after all. "Tell me about her," Sarah said finally. "Tell me about my mother." Margaret rose slowly and walked to the old china cabinet, retrieving a photo album she hadn't opened in 15 years. She returned to the table and began turning pages, revealing images of a young woman with Sarah's dark hair and determined chin. Sarah studied the photographs hungrily, seeing herself reflected in this stranger who was her mother. "What happened to her? Why didn't I know about you?" Margaret's face crumpled with the weight of old regrets. "We fought. She wanted to marry a boy I thought was wrong for her. Your father, I suppose. I was so certain I knew what was best for her future. When she turned 18, she left, said she never wanted to see me again. But surely you tried to find her." "Of course I did. For years. I hired investigators, called every Rebecca Williams in 3 states. But she'd changed her name, disappeared completely. I always wondered if she'd had children, if somewhere out there I had grandchildren I'd never meet. Sarah shifted Emma to her other arm, processing this revelation. She died when I was 7. Car accident. I went into foster care after that. Margaret's heart broke anew, imagining her granddaughter alone in the system while she'd been here, grieving and searching. All those years you were out there, and I never knew. The night I came here, Sarah said slowly, it wasn't random, was it? Something drew me to this street, to your house specifically. Margaret had wondered about that herself. Of all the places Sarah could have stopped during that blizzard, she'd chosen the driveway of her own grandmother's house. Perhaps Rebecca guided you here, she said softly. Perhaps she knew we both needed each other. They sat in contemplative silence, both women grappling with the magnitude of what they'd discovered. Emma stirred in Sarah's arms, making soft baby sounds that filled the quiet kitchen with new life. What happens now? Sarah asked. Margaret reached across the table and took her granddaughter's hand. Now we move forward, together. We can't get back the lost years, but we can make the most of what we have left. Sarah squeezed her grandmother's fingers. I want Emma to know her great-grandmother. I want her to grow up with family stories and traditions and all the things I never had. She will, Margaret promised, her voice strong despite her tears. And you'll have them too. It's never too late to build a family. As if sensing the importance of the moment, Emma opened her eyes and looked directly at Margaret. The baby's gaze was clear and knowing, and Margaret felt something shift inside her chest, a piece of her heart that had been closed for decades finally opening again. The DNA test had given them scientific proof, but Margaret realized she'd known the truth in her bones from almost the beginning. Love, it seemed, recognized love, even across generations of separation and loss. Outside, spring was finally asserting itself after the long winter, and inside the small house, 3 generations of women were learning what it meant to be family. The DNA results lay scattered across Margaret's kitchen table like fallen leaves, each page containing fragments of truth that had taken decades to surface. Sarah sat beside her, one hand protectively over her rounded belly, the other reaching for Margaret's trembling fingers. I don't understand, Sarah whispered, staring at the official letterhead. How is this possible? Margaret's voice came out as barely more than a breath. Your grandmother, Elizabeth Chen. She was my daughter. The words hung in the air between them, heavy with years of buried grief. Margaret closed her eyes, and suddenly she was 22 again, unmarried and desperate, standing in the corridor of St. Mary's Home for Unwed Mothers. They told me she died, Margaret continued, her voice gaining strength. The nuns said there were complications during birth. They showed me a tiny grave behind the chapel, told me to forget and move on with my life. She laughed bitterly, as if forgetting your own child was something you could simply choose to do. Sarah's grip tightened. But she didn't die. She lived. She had my father, and my father had me. The adoption papers were forged, Margaret said, pulling out another document Detective Morrison had helped her obtain. Elizabeth was sold to a family in California who desperately wanted a child. The Chen family gave her love, education, everything I couldn't provide. But the nuns, they pocketed the money and told me she was gone forever. Sarah studied the photograph Margaret handed her, a young woman with familiar eyes, standing beside a man in a military uniform. My grandfather. Yes, Elizabeth married young, had your father when she was barely 19. She never knew about me, never knew she was adopted until... Margaret's voice faltered. Until what? Until she was dying of cancer at 37. She hired a private investigator, tried to find her birth mother, but by then St. Mary's had burned down and the records were supposedly destroyed. She died not knowing I had spent every day of her life wondering if she was happy, if she was loved, if she ever thought about the mother who gave her away. Tears streamed down Sarah's face. She did think about you. My father told me she used to talk about her angel mother. Some imaginary woman she dreamed about who sang lullabies and made everything safe. He thought it was just childhood fantasy. Margaret pressed her hand to her mouth, overwhelmed. All those years of guilt, of wondering if she'd made the right choice, of imagining the daughter who was supposedly buried in that empty grave. Elizabeth had been out there, living and loving and creating the family that had eventually led to this moment. "The night I found you in that snowstorm," Margaret said slowly, "something felt familiar. Your eyes, the way you held your shoulders when you were afraid. I thought it was just an old woman's loneliness, projecting connections that weren't there. But they were there," Sarah said firmly. "All along, they were there." Margaret nodded, pulling out the final document, her will, which she'd revised that morning. "I want you to have the house, Sarah, the money I've saved, everything. It should have gone to Elizabeth, and through her to your father, and now to you and your baby. Margaret, I can't." "You can, and you will." Margaret's voice held the authority of 8 decades of hard-earned wisdom. "That baby you're carrying is my great-grandchild. This family line that I thought ended with me? It didn't end. It continued, and it led me to you." Sarah stood abruptly, pacing to the window where the first green shoots of spring were pushing through the last patches of snow. "What about James? He doesn't know any of this. He still thinks I'm just some girl who got pregnant and ran away." "Then we tell him," Margaret said simply. "We tell him the truth, all of it. What if he doesn't believe us? What if he thinks we're making this up to get his attention back?" Margaret joined her at the window, wrapping an arm around Sarah's shoulders. "Then he's not the man I thought he was, and he's not worthy of you or this baby. But I don't think that's who he is. I think he's a man who's been hurt and confused, but underneath it all, he loves you. Love doesn't disappear just because pride gets in the way." Sarah leaned into Margaret's embrace, feeling the strange comfort of a connection that transcended explanation. "I'm scared." "So am I," Margaret admitted. "I lost one daughter to lies and secrecy. I won't lose another to fear." She turned Sarah to face her, seeing Elizabeth's eyes looking back at her across 2 generations. "We're family now, really and truly. Whatever happens next, we face it together." Through the window, they watched James's truck pull into the driveway, right on schedule for the conversation that would change everything. Again. The morning sun streamed through the hospital windows as Margaret held her great-granddaughter for the first time. The baby's tiny fingers wrapped around Margaret's weathered thumb, and she felt a completeness she hadn't experienced since her own children were born decades ago. "She's perfect," Margaret whispered, tears sliding down her cheeks. "Absolutely perfect." Emma, exhausted but radiant, watched from the hospital bed. The labor had been long but without complications, and now, seeing Margaret cradle baby Rose, named after Margaret's mother, Emma knew she had made the right choice that snowy night when she had knocked on a stranger's door. Dr. Harrison entered the room, clipboard in hand. "Everything looks excellent. You can go home tomorrow if you'd like." She paused, studying the 3 generations before her. "I have to say, in 30 years of practice, I've rarely seen such a strong support system built in such a short time." Margaret looked up from the baby. "Sometimes family isn't just about blood. Sometimes it's about choice." Later that afternoon, as Emma dozed, Margaret sat in the rocking chair by the window. Still holding Rose, the events of the past few months played through her mind like scenes from someone else's life. 6 months ago, she had been a lonely widow, estranged from her family, marking time until death. Now she was a great-grandmother again, with a daughter-in-law who had become like her own child. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. David entered, carrying flowers and wearing the expression of a man still adjusting to sudden fatherhood. Behind him came Sarah, Margaret's daughter, who had driven up from Portland the moment she heard about the baby. "Mom," Sarah said softly, approaching Margaret. The relationship between mother and daughter had been slowly healing since Christmas, when Emma's presence had somehow made it safe for them to speak honestly about their years of hurt and misunderstanding. "She's beautiful, isn't she?" Margaret said, not looking up from Rose. Sarah knelt beside the rocking chair. "She is, And Mom, I need to say something. Sarah's voice caught. Watching you with Emma these past months, seeing how you opened your heart, it made me realize how much time we've wasted. How much I've missed your wisdom, your strength. Margaret finally looked at her daughter. We've both made mistakes, Sarah, but maybe it's not too late to do better. David approached Emma's bedside, still seeming uncertain of his role. The DNA test had confirmed what they all suspected. He was Rose's father. The anger and denial he had initially felt had gradually transformed into something resembling acceptance, though love would take more time. How are you feeling? He asked Emma. Tired, happy, scared, Emma admitted. But good scared, if that makes sense. David nodded. It does. I'm scared too. He looked at the baby in Margaret's arms. I wasn't ready to be a father 6 months ago. I'm not sure I'm ready now. But I want to try. For her. For you. Emma reached for his hand. That's all anyone can do. Try. As evening approached, the room filled with quiet conversation and gentle laughter. Margaret had called her son James, who was driving up from California with his family. Even Emma's foster mother, Mrs. Chen, had sent flowers and a promise to visit soon. Detective Morrison stopped by briefly, not in his official capacity, but as someone who had become invested in their story. He brought news that Emma's case against her former boyfriend had been resolved. The young man had pled guilty to assault and would serve community service while attending mandatory counseling. It's over, he told Emma. You don't have to look over your shoulder anymore. As the visitors gradually left and the hospital settled into its evening rhythm, Margaret remained in the rocking chair with Rose while Emma rested. The baby slept peacefully, her tiny chest rising and falling with perfect regularity. Thank you, Emma said quietly in the dimness. For what, dear? For saving us. Both of us. Emma's voice was thick with emotion. That night when you found me, I had given up. I thought there was nowhere in the world where I belonged. Margaret smiled. You saved me too, you know. I was just better at hiding how lost I was. They sat in comfortable silence, 3 generations sharing the sacred quiet of a hospital room. Outside, snow was beginning to fall again, but this time it felt like a blessing rather than a threat. Margaret thought about the letter she had written earlier that day, a new will that would ensure Emma and Rose were provided for, that the house would remain theirs, no matter what happened. But more than money or property, she was leaving them something precious, the knowledge that they were loved, that they belonged somewhere, that family could be created through choice as much as through birth. Rose stirred in her arms, and Margaret hummed softly, the same lullaby she had sung to her own children and that her mother had sung to her. The melody drifted through the room like a benediction, carrying with it the promise of new beginnings and the unbreakable bonds that had transformed them all.